My name is Josh Margolis. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Cantor CO2E. Cantor CO2E is an environmental credit trading and advisory firm owned by global financial service provider Cantor Fitzgerald. I'm honored to have been asked by Louise Blouin, Matthew Kabatoff, and the Blouin Foundation to serve as moderator again this year of the session entitled Environment, Governance, Innovation, Action. We're extremely fortunate to have with us 4 distinguished panelists, which I'd like to welcome now. Introduce you to them. I'll lay the foundation. Michael Schlesinger will provide us with a set the stage discussion, presentation, and then we're going to have a very interesting back and forth involving the panelists and you. And at the end of the session, we'll have a great deal to have discussed about the conundrum that faces us: climate change, environmental action, policy, and cable TV. So let me offer my greetings to Dr. Arent. Dr. Arent is the Executive Director of the Joint Institute for Strategic Energy Analysis of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. He's also the author of an expert reviewer for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC Special Report on Renewable Energy. Doug is on the Policy Subcommittee of the National Petroleum Council and a Senior Visiting Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Dr. Malone, at the end, is, welcome Dr. Malone. You're the Patrick J. McGovern Professor of Management at the MIT School of Management, the founding director of the MIT Center for Collective Intelligence, the founder and director of the MIT Center for Coordination Science. Joining next to Dr. Malone and next to Doug is Carl Pope. Welcome, Carl. Carl is the chairman, former executive director, and 30-year member of the Sierra Club, the co-author of Strategic Ignorance: Why the Bush Administration is Recklessly Destroying a Century of Environmental Progress, author of Sahib, an American Misadventure in India, author of Hazardous Waste in America, a Peace Corps volunteer, and I'd like to now welcome Michael Schlesinger. To my left, Michael Schlesinger is Professor of Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, Director of Climate Research Group within the Department of Atmospheric Sciences. And he's also, as an IPCC recipient of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. We arrive here at a very interesting time, a time when the need to act and the obstacles to act to meaningful action have never been clearer and more significant. On the one hand, those who spend time in the field and then participate have a different perspective than those who participate in cable television shows. They tell us that we're measuring the historical high temperatures, acid levels in the oceans, storms and their consequences, glacial melting, and extremes in temperature and precipitation. We're also seeing jobs and economic vitality emerge from the green stimulus, organic and government mandated, in China, India, the European Union, and in my home state of California. But others who have successfully turned climate into a wedge issue. The drifts of Snowmageddon have been followed by a blizzard of interests that recognize that those who benefit most from a low-carbon future are not voting right now. And they may not even be born. They recognize that votes can be secured by asserting the reductions in carbon are directly proportional to jobs and economic growth. That the more carbon reductions that you have, the fewer jobs that you're going to realize. These interests contributed to Copenhagen's failure, the Senate's lack of action, and a general consensus that nothing on a national basis will happen in 2011 or even 2012 in terms of a national climate change program. So the headlines would tell you, except there is a story, one that I would like to discuss today with you and my panelists. While many rue the lack of a price on carbon and of a national program, we see that trading of carbon credits is ongoing, derived from sources in the US and internationally, we see that California, the nation's 8th largest economy, with a 1.8 trillion GDP and 36 million people, California continues to implement a climate change cap-and-trade program. And it looks to me like Proposition 23, the initiative to overturn AB 32, is not going to succeed. We're witnessing EPA's implementation of a broad and comprehensive greenhouse gas control program, one that could cause between 13,000 and 1.6 million sources to participate in climate change control, and that's diverting investment dollars away from coal into clean energy sources. We're seeing other federal agencies and state legislatures take steps that put a price on carbon. So it's not just about what happened or didn't happen in Copenhagen, or what did or didn't happen in the Senate. There's a lot more to discuss, and this is where I'd like to ask Michael Schlesinger to participate and stand before you and give him a few minutes to share his perspective on where we are and where we need to go.
Thank you. I have 3 points that I want to make. About 4 years ago, I made a calculation of the climate change throughout this century for the Attorney General of California, who happened to sign my PhD when he was governor way back in the 20th century. And the reason I did this was because of Assembly Bill 32, which was alluded to already, passed 4 years ago in California, to, in effect, set the CAFE standards through the California's Clean Air Act. And as a result thereof, the auto manufacturers are suing California, the manufacturers in both Detroit and Tokyo. And so I was asked to make a calculation, which I would have shown you. But never mind. I looked over 4 possible scenarios of emissions of greenhouse gases in this century and several different values of the most important climatic quantity, the climate sensitivity, which I won't elaborate because of time. And so I made 12 calculations, weighed them probabilistically to get an expected value, and that showed that absent any climate change policy, that the global warming by the end of the century would exceed the 2 degrees that has been chosen by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change as the maximum allowed warming that we can have without the threat of catastrophic climate change. And I also made a calculation that I called my 1% solution, where the world decides to mitigate the emission of CO2 over a 100-year time period, so roughly 1% per year. And if that happens, then by the end of the century, the warming stays below the 2-degree allowable warming of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it plateaus, and in the next century would begin to go down as the natural carbon sinks would draw down the CO2 concentration. So from that, the point I wish to make is that unless the entire world begins to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, and by that I mean the developing countries as well as the developed countries, we will not stay below the threshold that's been chosen by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The second point, I'm on the Illinois Climate Change Advisory Group, and 4 years ago we worked for 2 years to develop 24 policies to reduce the emissions of Illinois' greenhouse gases back to 1990 values. By 2020, that's a 26% reduction. And we accomplished this, but there are 2 salient points. One, 23 out of the 24 policies got us only halfway to the target, and the 24th policy, which is cap and trade, took us the rest of the way, the remaining 50%. That shows you how difficult. So the 23 policies are everything you can think of, you know, carbon capture and storage, energy efficiency, whatever you've ever thought of or anybody else ever thought of, got us only halfway there. And cap and trade, by its design, got us the other 50%. So the problem is a difficult one to solve. Second point about this is, economic analyses were done of these 24 policies, and it was found out that the net cost was negative. In other words, Illinois should adopt these 24 policies even if there were no global warming. So that's a point that should be kept in mind. And the last point I wanted to talk about the fact that there are 3 regional groups in the United States, one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast, and one in the Midwest, which consist of 26 of the 50 United States. I think that's correct, 26. And then there are 8 observers, taking that, states that are observers, that takes that up to 34. So 60% of the states in the United States have designed, developed a plan similar to the one that we did in Illinois. So I think that China and India will not engage in reductions in their greenhouse gas emissions until the United States begins. And so the question is, how can the United States begin? And I think, as our moderator said before the beginning, we should use what's already in the kitchen. And we have these 3 regional groups, which contain 60% of the United States. And so what we need to do, in my opinion, is form an alliance of those 3 regional groups. And in order to do that, I think the president should convene a White House conference and invite the governors of those 34 states to come and discuss and start this greenhouse gas reduction alliance. Those are the 3 points I wish to make.
Thank you, Michael. Have a seat. No, have a seat. So, environment, governance, innovation, action. How policymakers, elected and otherwise, and politicians can and should make a difference. What role innovation can and must play in addressing this conundrum. Where and how we should expect action on achieving our climate change objectives. I ask the panelists now to think about a question which I'll pose to you and then ask you to respond to it in order, and then we'll see where the discussion leads us. The problem, I'd like you to think about the problem and define for me what the problem is, where we need to get to by 2050, your realistic assessment of achieving this objective, the tools that we're going to use, how we're going to get there, a sober assessment of our chances of success, and an expectation of what will actually play out over the coming couple of years and then the decades that follow. So Michael Schlesinger has made a proposal. One of his proposals is the key to solving the problem is bringing together the Midwestern Governors Initiative, the Western Climate Initiative, the RGGI program, and the Eastern states. Have the president convene this group of eminent governors and look for consensus and use the bully pulpit to achieve results. Doug, what do you think the problem is? And tell me where we should be going in the near term, and ultimately, does it get us to where we need to get to in the longer term? Can we make a difference?
Good set of questions and difficult answers, none of them very clear. I'm going to muddy the water a little bit further because from the perspective that I sit from the Joint Institute at the National Renewable Energy Lab, I think the problem is beyond just thinking about environment, and I think we heard about this from this morning's panel and some other discussions, where it has to include more broadly, for example, the Millennium Development Goals that have been talked about here for the last 2 days as well. And so we have to look at both environment, access, economic development, economic prosperity, geopolitics and energy security, if you want to use that term, thinking energy specifically, but also broadly natural resource stewardship. And I think in that perspective, one then has to step back and look at provision of energy and how energy is interrelated to all of those aspects, including things that are very, very basic in terms of water, food, education-related services, et cetera. And in doing that, then, I think trying to answer your question, how big is the problem? The problem actually is enormous, but not insurmountable. And so I have definitely a glimmer of hope that I think we can actually make, and we are making, significant progress on it. And let me just highlight a couple of pieces. I got kind of two pieces that I do want to just offer. One is that there is a fundamental shift in our understanding and I think our appreciation of diversity of supply in the energy world, whereas we have embraced and exploited, in fact, the attributes of very concentrated energy supply in terms of fossil fuels, oil, gas, coal, et cetera, over the last decade, and the abilities to use those at economies, great economies. And so embracing a diversification of that, which may include carbon capture and storage, nuclear, and certainly from my perspective, renewables and a lot of efficiency, I think is upon us and needs to accelerate. And the landscape for that actually is fairly dramatic. That for those of us who pay attention to the details, to summarize, I think is pretty remarkable. More than 85 countries have active policies and goals toward alternative energies, either in the electric sector or in the fuels sector. Includes 35 states and regions, a couple of examples already brought up here. Last year alone, globally, alternative energy were 36% of new energy supply in the electric sector globally. That's pretty remarkable when people think of the growth in electricity demand. And that represents about $150 billion a year in global transactions, of which carbon trading certainly is one, but corporate finance, venture finance, and public finance markets as well. That's fairly substantial, and if you look at anticipated projections, that is set to perhaps quadruple in the next 10 years or so, up to $500, $600 billion a year, which is kind of the scale that it needs to be at in order to make real impact with some urgency. And so kind of back to your question, what do we need to do? And do we have a likelihood of really achieving substantial progress toward mid-century 2050? I think we need to take both a mindful and patient perspective, but act with a sense of urgency. So we have to look at innovation both on the technology front, i.e. R&D plus demonstration and aggressive policies toward deployment. We have to look at innovation in the business sector front, creating new financial models, rethinking regulatory structures, et cetera. And we have to think broadly around the policy environment and thinking, I think, as you mentioned, a heterogeneity of policies going forward that may or may not have an international agreement to adhere to or not, but we certainly see examples of a lot of that as well. And so the theme continues in that front as well. Embrace diversification, diversification of technologies, diversification of solutions, and in fact, diversification of policies as well. And I think with that, we have a strong likelihood of making significant progress. My crystal ball is not super clear in terms of what 2050 look like, but I certainly hope that we can achieve the goal of sustainability.
I detect optimism there, Doug. From your perspective, this is a problem that can be solved if we only slice and dice it, and then try to solve it in a way that attacks a number of different angles, a number of different aspects of it. The Big Bang Theory, whether it be Copenhagen, a global accord, or a national cap and trade program, doesn't seem to be the solution that you laid on the table. It's more a matter of there's a number of different aspects of this problem: technological, energy, policy, communication. And from your perspective, it's attack on all fronts.
That's correct. I think that it summarized very well what a National Academy panel came out with that I was a part of, which was even if we have a carbon policy today, given the economic modeling that has been done, if the impact of a carbon policy needs to be supplemented by a whole suite of policies across that whole landscape of innovation through to sector-specific policies. And that could, in fact, be implemented on an international level as well. One might think of, for example, technology accords rather than just a climate accord itself.
Carl, it's from listening to Doug, I mean, there's optimism exuding. You've been at this for a good long time, 3 decades plus, carrying the flag and yelling at the top of your voice that we have a problem, but also working strategically around the edges to build coalitions. Could you give me your take on what our realistic chances of achieving a long-term objective are and what our near-term objectives ought to be in strategies and a realistic assessment of whether or not we're going to get there?
Well, I'll try, and I'll begin by saying that trying to understand this problem from the economic top-down has not served us well. So the first thing I would urge us to do is to, for the moment, not forget about economics, but forget about macroeconomics, because it hasn't been terribly helpful. I'm going to begin with this little exercise. It's my smartphone. Many of you in the room have some rough equivalent. I can do many things with it. I can actually locate large mountaintop removal mines in Appalachia on a map in it. But one of the things I can do is to call a taxi driver in Mumbai. The signal with which I reach that taxi driver in Mumbai will not pass through a single piece of equipment designed more than 10 years ago. The electrons on that back wall there probably get here from either a coal-fired power plant designed when Calvin Coolidge was president or a nuclear power plant designed when Winston Churchill was premier of the Soviet Union, through light bulbs patented when William Howard Taft was in the White House. One of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, why has the energy sector not been the beneficiary of what is now the normal rate of technological innovation in a modern industrial economy? Why is the energy sector stuck so far in the past? And the answer I'm going to offer is, it's not accidental, and it is not because people in the energy sector are not innovative, because the technology, for example, of pumping oil has been dramatically transformed in the last 20 years. It's the technology of burning oil that hasn't changed hardly at all. And the reason is that in the 1920s, when the fossil fuels emerged as the dominant force of energy for industrial societies, we rigged the energy markets. Or, as we saw it then, we designed them. In the 1920s, fuel was abundant, information was scarce, pollution was free. And we designed energy markets to take advantage of that landscape. We designed them to resist innovation, because in the absence of information, innovation tended to mean instability. We designed them to squander fuel, because in an abundance of fuel, that was not an issue. And we designed them to externalize all their pollution costs, because we didn't think they mattered. So we have hardwired into the energy sector of our economy a resistance to innovation. That's my first point. Second point, I want to go back to what you said, which is, and there are also McKinsey charts. There are all of these charts which show that half of the progress we need to make towards decarbonizing the world's economy, whether domestically or globally, make money. They don't cost money. They make money. Give you an example. There are 1.5 billion people in the world for whom the relevant fossil fuel is not coal or gasoline, but kerosene. They're the world's poorest people. They have no access to electricity. They light and cook on kerosene. If lumens from a solar cell came in a bottle, like this one, they would cost about a quarter of what lumens from kerosene cost. So there are actually 1.5 billion people in the world for whom solar power, distributed photovoltaic power, is the cheapest source of lighting. And in fact, is about a quarter of the cost of what they're paying right now for the lighting they have. Almost none of them have the ability to go and buy solar power in the marketplace. So you have massive market failure because, again, of the way in which, in this case, subsidy and distribution systems in places like India were designed. So if half of the progress pays for itself, I'm going to suggest we focus on the half that pays for itself and not worry about the half that doesn't pay for itself. We get that half done in the next 10 years. We'd be well ahead of your curve. And we could use the money that we'll make doing that to do the additional R&D to perfect the technologies we need. I'm not a Luddite. We need better technology. But the key thing is to figure out where are the barriers to innovation and market clearing within energy markets and get rid of them. And my third point is, so why is this not changing? Well, I heard Jim Rogers of Duke Energy last night, and he made an interesting point. The average 40% of America's carbon emissions come from the electricity sector. The average household spends only 1.9% of its expenses on electricity. It used to be 2.5, so it's come down quite a bit. Yet when Congress debated climate and energy legislation, you would have thought that if we increased the price of electricity by 25%, which in fact the bill would not have done, that there would be economic calamity. Well, 25% of 1.9% is about 0.5% of average household income would have gone up over 15 years. But Congress reacted as if this was going to be an enormous economic hit to the average household. Why is that? Well, I have a map here which you can't really see, but it's there. And it's a map of the states that get more than 2/3 of their electricity from coal. There are 19 of them. There are 2 additional states that produce large quantities of coal. So there are 21 states that are heavily dependent in their electricity grid on either producing or consuming coal or both. If you multiply 21 states by 2 United States senators, you get an interesting number. It's 42. 2 votes more than are needed to pass anything through the United States Senate. So in effect, the coal industry at the moment has a stranglehold on the legislative process in the United States. And since it is selling a product which is no longer competitive in truly competitive global marketplaces where people pay for all their costs and where innovation is allowed, the coal industry's only way to stay in business is to prevent Congress from reforming energy markets and making them more innovative and efficient. There's a short-term lesson there. I think that the core failure, the core intellectual failure that left us high and dry in both Copenhagen and Washington was made a long time ago. There's been all this talk about, well, Obama didn't do enough, and the bill wasn't well designed, and it should have been a carbon tax, or it should have been cap and rebate. Or if the Danes had only handled the logistics in Copenhagen better, everybody would have been happier. I'm going to suggest, at the end of the day, none of that mattered at all. Because about 20 years ago, when the climate scientists began to get people like me scared, the scientists said, it's end game climatologically. And we jumped to the conclusion that we were in the end of the chess game against coal and oil. And we played the game as if we were trying to checkmate coal or oil, which is what a price on carbon does. The moment you price carbon, coal and oil start going away. But I have never been able, in the opening moves of a chess game, to checkmate a skilled adversary. And coal and oil are skilled and powerful adversaries. And I think the mistake we made was by pursuing a price on carbon as our opening gambit, we left them with the strategic high ground for the whole game, and we lost. We need to take their pieces off the table. The way you checkmate a skilled adversary in chess is by taking away his bishops and his knights and his rooks, and by getting your pawns to the opposite file and getting them to be additionally powerful players. So I'm going to suggest that the most important thing for all of us to do is to look for special favors that energy markets do for coal and oil, and knock those special favors out one by one or 10 by 10, so that the number of states, for example, that get all their electricity from coal drops to 8. 16 senators cannot block action in the United States Senate. But until we understand that we are playing chess against a skilled adversary and that we are not in endgame, I think we will continue to squander our opportunities.
The perspective you lay on the table, Carl, is intriguing on the one hand, but confusing to me in another. One of the rooks, or even I'd call it the king of the coal interests, had something to say about climate in December, which I was stunned by. He said, "The truth is that some form of climate legislation will likely become public policy." And to give away who it was, he's further said, "West Virginians can choose to anticipate change and adapt to it, or resist and be overrun by it." So it seems that we were precariously close to a major breakthrough, where we're doing titration, dripping catalyst into clear solution, and it nearly turned blue. And that there was something on the table before that was speaking to the coal states. And the other thing that you said, which I think we should latch on, find out what that message was that convinced Senator Byrd to make those statements. The other thing that I'd like to grab onto is that it's not, I don't see it as us versus them. I see it as more like Pogo. We have met the enemy, and it is us. Because when I hear the shrill cries of "we can't do it," price on carbon costs jobs, cap and trade costs jobs, clean fuels cost jobs, it's from the broad American spectrum. And I wonder if communication has a significant element to play, and if the message that we're trying to convey is being done with words that are not speaking to those whose interests we're looking after. And to some extent, those people are not born. My kids are not voting yet. But I wonder, Tom Malone, Dr. Malone, if you have a sense of how communication can play a role in this process, in getting from here to where we need to get to.
Yeah. I think that is really a key. The two speakers before, especially, and to some degree Michael as well, talked mostly about what the solution is or what the solution looks like. What I'd like to do is not talk about what the solution is. I don't have a particular position on that. What I'd like to do instead is talk about how we might find a good solution. And to anticipate, I think communication is key. To some degree, Michael gave a suggestion or a proposal about that, which was the governors or the states' coalitions getting together to come up with a solution. I'd like to propose not an alternative to that, but at least a potential supplement to that, which is working in exactly the opposite direction. Not a top-down solution, but a bottom-up solution. I'd like to suggest that this problem, I think all of us in the room today probably agree, is a very important problem, the problem of what to do about global climate change. In some ways, perhaps maybe even the most important problem we humans have ever faced. But at the same time, we humans are faced by this very complex, potentially extremely important problem that confronts all of us. We also have a kind of opportunity for solving this problem that we never had before. If you look at examples like Wikipedia and Linux and so forth, you see that it's now possible, using the internet, to organize vastly larger numbers of people to solve very big and complicated problems in ways that could never be done before. And my proposal is that we use that kind of very broad collective problem solving to help us come up with solutions to this problem. In fact, this is not just a proposal. We're actually doing some work along these lines to harness the collective intelligence of thousands of people all over the world to come up with proposals for what we can do about global climate change. As I said, I don't have a particular position about what the answer is, but I think this bottom-up approach is a very promising way of dealing with not a single big bang, but a whole combination of a lot of different things with whatever is in the kitchen, et cetera. One of the things we have done is to create an online platform we call the Climate Collab to enable, to facilitate this process. And we're just about to launch in a couple of weeks a series of what we hope will be annual contests for people to submit proposals for what to do about global climate change. One of the distinctive aspects of the proposals people can submit in this online platform is that they're not just words. These proposals at their core all will have a specific simulation model of some of the quantitative actions we could take, like various kinds of emission reductions in different regions of the world, and then automatically computed consequences of these actions on things like temperature change, sea level rise, and so forth. So every proposal will have at its heart a quantitative set of assumptions like that, which makes sure that everybody is talking about what the real problems are and not focusing all their attention on something that might be only 1% of the problem. But every proposal, in addition to those quantitative elements, also includes or can include as much qualitative things as the entrants in the contest want. For instance, text about why a particular proposal is plausible, what kind of political or behavioral or other steps would be needed to make this actually happen. They can also include text about why it's desirable. And interestingly, we're also encouraging people to include artistic representations of the world that would result from the proposal they are making. So these might be short stories about what it would be like for a suburban resident of Chicago, or a video of what it would be like for somebody in Mumbai, or other kinds of artistic things to make these sometimes very dry and abstract statistics much more concrete for people who will have to decide about them. Part of what that suggests is that to really develop successful proposals like this, I think will require teams of people with a variety of different kinds of skills. Some people will need to be quantitatively inclined enough to deal with simulation models. Others will need to know enough about policy making and political processes to say sensible things about that. And others may need to have artistic skills to represent these future worlds. So we hope that by bringing or providing an opportunity for lots of people to be involved, lots of new ideas will come out. But we want to focus attention on those that are at least plausible. So we want to have 2 rounds of the contest, in the first round of which expert judges will select the proposals that are most feasible. In other words, rule out things that are just completely impossible, and also try to have things that are well presented and include a variety of diverse or novel ideas. And then in the final round of the contest, we want to have popular voting, where anybody who wants to register on this site can vote for the proposals they find most desirable. And then we're working on ways, even in the first year, and we hope even more in later years, of conveying the results of this contest to policymakers in the US Congress, Department of Energy, UN, and so forth. So our hope is that at the minimum, a bottom-up collective process like this can at least educate many more people in the public about what the real issues are, the kinds of, or the level and scope of changes that will be needed to really solve the problem. We also hope and believe that by, in some sense, trying to solve the problem themselves, many people who are today uncertain about why and what is hard we'll come to understand the problem much better, and hopefully that will lead to an increasing political agreement about the things that actually need to be done. Finally, in some sense most importantly, what we hope and expect is that if we can really constructively involve many thousands of people from all over the world, creative, intelligent, interested people, most of whom haven't been actively engaged in this dialogue before, if we can really engage all those people, we're likely to come up with better actual solutions to the problem than anything a few of us sitting on a stage here or in a conference room at the UN or wherever will come up with. That's the hope.
Intriguing. It's, I take it as a continuous online voting, looking for solutions that's engaging of all that have access to Safari or Internet Explorer, and a feedback loop which takes that result and delivers it to policymakers, which are the result of another process of voting. And hence we have a group of senators and representatives and policymakers that are arguably responsible for putting us exactly where we are now in the conundrum we're in. And I would like to believe would be more responsive to this online process. I'm challenged, though, to come to that conclusion, given the crux that we find ourselves in now between a year-long process which led us to the brink, and then a sense that nothing will happen for a couple of years. And there were two headlines that I'd like to offer in terms of launching the next discussion. One was that Wood Mackenzie predicted that if they looked at the North American coal-fired capacity, the plants that are online now, Canada and the US, and they have made the prediction that 60 gigawatts, 17%, is going to go offline by 2030. 90% of that in the next 10 years. Those folks, that represents, talking about from Carl's perspective, we're hardwired for change, to resist change. We may in fact see change evolving in a short amount of time with some old lady institutions that we have come to expect will always be there. The other headline that was of interest to me is that Governor Christ in New Jersey has decided that the deficit is fairly significant and that funds which were generated through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative auction are going to be removed from the Climate Office and used for general purposes. That, to me, is what happens when decision makers faced with theory also have potholes to fill and teachers to pay. And it makes me wonder, come back to the proposal that was laid on the table earlier, bringing together the governors from the different regions. And I wonder what sort of discussions that they're going to have as the doors are shut. When they say, can we afford to tackle climate change, given the very real problems that we have in front of us now? I'm not going to get reelected for protecting the next generation. I'm going to get elected for protecting this generation, for protecting jobs now. Imagine, take me through that discussion that we're going to have in the White House, where the governors are going to bring together their concerns and look for a common consensus.
If I may, I'd like to make a comment about communication and about coal, and then maybe try to answer your question. I'm at the moment teaching Climate and Global Change, a 100-level course. And it's populated mostly by incoming freshmen. And every time I teach this course, I have a few students who at the end of the course hold the same views they held coming into the course. No amount of information that I convey to them about the reality of climate change, the reality that it's caused by human beings, penetrates. They have a whole framework you can call it a religion if you like, that human beings are not, cannot change the climate. And of course, that's, as a teacher, that's dismaying. So, you know, summarize, my mind's made up, don't confuse me with the facts. So there are some people like that, and unfortunately, it's not a vanishingly small number, and most of them are conservatives, and they have this view, somewhat anti-conservative or anti-conservation. So I don't know how we deal with that. It's rather tantamount to my telling the Pope there's no God, or telling an atheist that there is. They know it's otherwise. So I'm dismayed by that reality. Coal that you mentioned, in my state, Illinois, there's as much energy in the coal as there is in the oil in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Qatar. And that's just one state. And you better believe, well, there were people from the United Mine Workers on this Illinois Climate Change Advisory Group. They were all stakeholders except me. And you better believe that the governor, the former senator from Illinois, now the president, pretty much wants to use that natural resource, not leave it in the ground. And that is a heavy burden to transcend. If we can do carbon capture and sequestration, that will help, but that's a pretty big if. So that's another confounding factor that bothers me. And to answer your question, what would the governors talk about? As I said, and you said too, Carl, the program we developed had a negative cost, including the cap and trade. Of course, of the 24 policies, 19 were adopted unanimously. Everybody agreed. The 5 important ones, including the one that's based on California's Assembly Bill 32, it was a 2-to-1 split in favor, and you can guess who was against that. There was a vice president, lady from Ford, kept telling us all the time that California's law was not going to be promulgated. So I think in the White House meeting, the people who will come there will know already that at least in several states, the cost for the program is negative. As I said, even if there weren't any global warming, we should adopt those policies. In Illinois, they raised the standard of living, they raised the employment, they raised the gross state product. It's a sort of win-win-win.
Josh, I might offer a couple more thoughts on what that dialogue might look like, because I think it's, given the chief executive officer roles of governors and the president, if you can imagine that dialogue, I think they have a unique position to look across the landscape and to have to balance multiple, what you think may be conflicting priorities, but in fact might actually be cooperative goals. And one can think of a half a dozen off the top of my head around competitiveness, trade, exploitation of, for lack of a better term, domestic resources, which happen to also be very fruitile in terms of alternative energy technologies. So I just published a quick paper in the National Academy's journal that articulates a fairly well-known fact, at least for those that study the resource base, that the renewable resources in the US are about 200 times more on an annual basis than our current energy consumption, 200 times. And that's recurring. Those are renewable resources. That's not a coal resource or a natural gas or a coal resource. That's an enormous resource base, which is domestic and renewable, that could be exploited, quote unquote. But the resource base beyond that, I think when we think of competitiveness, technology innovation, thought leadership, and the other side of the equation, which we really haven't talked about, and I think we do need to talk about, which are the benefits. why does EPA, in fact, rule under the Clean Air Act? It is because of health impacts and because of the potential benefits of regulation to mitigating health impacts. And when one looks through the literature there and the knowledge base, there's enormous negative impact of what we're doing with our energy sector today, both locally as well as globally. And I think we do ourselves a disfavor by not recognizing the fact that there are enormous benefits that would come from spurring the innovation, which, as Carl said, is kind of built into the infrastructure of the energy system and really needs to be released. And so I think recognizing that, and recognizing very importantly that the incremental costs per se on energy costs themselves actually is incredibly small. If I remember back to now a relatively old calculation of decarbonizing just the US electric sector, it was roughly put out of approximately $3 per person per month. This was a calculation that was done by Pacala and Sokolow back when they published their famous wedges paper. So I reflect on that, and I know the calculation has changed in the years since then, but is it worth foregoing a cup of coffee to help improve our domestic and global environment?
Let's pick up on that note of optimism. Carl, let me ask you to reflect on your earlier theme, which is coming together with a different strategy, figuring out, picking things off one by one, and then the conundrum that we saw, that we see playing out: coal interest, jobs, climate change, price on carbon is a challenge. Carl, let me ask you to give me your opinion on something that's going on in my home state of California, AB 32, the Global Warming Solutions Act, 4 years ago, September, passed. California is now experiencing a 12.5% unemployment rate. Those who were opposing AB 32 have said that the clear way to defeat this measure, besides money, is to make the case that if you force people to reduce their emissions, you will cause a further increase in unemployment. And yet, in July, we have a poll of likely voters who say, despite the 12.5% unemployment rate, 61% favor AB 32. 61% is 28% oppose. That, to me, is a conundrum. One, it's a challenge for me to draw the line between those who support AB 32, and yet they know that they're suffering under a 12.5% unemployment rate. California likely voters see global warming as a somewhat serious threat to the economy. So this thing, which is going to play out over decades, the voters think that it's a problem to today's economy. They're rather blasé about Congress not acting, saying that California should have their own policies by 56% to 38%. So what are you doing at the Sierra Club to fuel this fire, to convince these people that, in fact, climate change, challenging climate change, solving the climate change problems, produces jobs?
Well, let me try to begin with where the voters are, not just in California, but more broadly. And there's an interesting reality to the numbers. If you take a poll, when these numbers bounce up with the seasons. But if you take a poll, and you ask Americans, how convinced are scientists that global warming is real and largely caused by human beings, you get a number, and that number bounces up and down. It's lower than it is in Europe. It's lower than we would like it to be. It's lower than scientists would like it to be. It's mostly somewhere between 55, let's say 55% is the median number. You then ask those same voters in the same poll at the same moment, how convinced are you personally that global warming is real and is caused by human beings? And the number of voters who say that they personally are convinced is larger than the number who believe that scientists are convinced, because they read the newspapers, and what the newspapers give them is scientific controversy, but in their own lives, they believe they are experiencing global warming in their own communities, and they get the fact that it's something people did. So you're at 63. You then ask, should the federal government take action to reduce the emissions of the substances which cause global warming? 76% in my hypothetical poll. So 10% of the public, which isn't convinced that global warming is real, wants the government to do something about it. They want the government to take action to prevent this thing which they're far from convinced actually exists. And then if you give them a suite of solutions, more fuel efficiency standards, renewable energy, making everybody retrofit their buildings to make them efficient, you give them a wide variety, every one of those solutions, with one exception, scores over 80%. The American people are convinced that an outmoded energy economy is hurting us in a variety of ways. They think global warming is a symptom of that outmoded energy economy, and they want energy reform, they want energy innovation. They are sold on the idea that the way to rebuild the American economy is with wind turbines, solar cells, high-performance windows, electric cars, natural gas trucks, high-speed rail. All of that stuff is what Americans see as the future. And global warming happens to be one of many reasons for doing it. So it's not really a conundrum. They're looking at the problem through a different lens. Policymakers, professors, environmentalists say, oh, we've got a problem called global warming, and we've got a problem called the trade deficit, and we got a problem called the war in Iraq, and we've got a problem called asthma in public schools. The public looks out and says, we got a problem called an outmoded energy economy based on yesterday's fossil fuel technologies. And they're there. But when the governors get together, to go back to your earlier question, I'm going to be blunt. The governors are saying, you know something? I don't want my local electric utility spending $5 million in a ballot against me in my next campaign. So the incumbent energy interests have a great deal more influence with opinion leaders than they do with the American people. And that's kind of the conundrum that I think is real. If the American people were making these decisions, they'd be unleashing energy innovation. They would not be adopting cap and trade. They're not very enthused about paying more money for things, but they're very enthused about innovation. So I think we've got a complex landscape in which the public is more with us than opinion leaders, even though opinion leaders may be better informed than the public. Information in this case is not translating into wisdom.
I'm not going to follow that. I was going to respond to two earlier points, if no one else wants to respond to that one immediately.
Okay.
First of all, you raised the point of whether the politicians who were elected by the general public would pay any attention to an online poll of the general public, any more attention than they're paying now. I think a key point is that what I was suggesting is not just that we'd have online voting of things, but that we'd have online creation of new proposals. So the hope is that there would be some better ideas that would come out that would be influential, at least in part, by kind of their inherent quality, not just the public support shown for them, though that also could be important. I think your point, Michael, about some people just don't pay attention to the facts, I think that's a very important point, worth pondering. I think that's true, and I think that not everyone would be swayed by any amount of facts. That is, there are some people who would not be swayed by any amount of facts. I think that doesn't mean that it's not useful to involve lots of people. Some of the people may be involved and never change their opinions, but others may well come up with good ideas and change their opinions. Another thing that suggests, I think, is that part of the solution that we need to design to this problem is how to either change or at least reduce the influence of people who are not swayed by the facts. So there are things you can do, public opinion or public relations, education, there's various kinds of things. The advertising industry is full of ideas about how to change people's opinions without using facts. So I think part of the solution may well involve those kind of non-logical or non-fact-based but emotional things that need to be done. That's not the part of the problem we're working on, but I think it is part of the solution that we need to design.
Well, I am concerned that the imminent change in the House of Representatives, which is likely to occur in November, changing chairpersons of all the committees, can set back an effort to deal with this problem for a decade.
So I can offer perhaps a glass half full look at that same conundrum, which is that, again, prior to the current domestic, well, the prior domestic debate on energy policy, which has basically fallen off except for the recent introduction of a renewable electric standard as of yesterday. Most quote-unquote energy policy per se oriented toward environmental change was actually implemented at state and regional levels and will continue to be driven by state and regional activities. And in particular, local environmental conditions will continue to drive change. Example in point, Xcel Energy, Colorado as well as Minnesota-based utility, announced a $900 million retrofit plan to change all of their Colorado-based Front Range coal plants to natural gas, approved by the Public Utility Commission and the ratepayers through that, in principle because they could not meet upcoming haze requirements that are set forth by the EPA. So again, this is an example of a utility responding to something different than just global warming, although clearly they're thinking about their carbon emissions as well because the conversion from coal to natural gas buys them a fair amount of benefit in that realm as well. But I go back to a diversification of approaches, a diversification of jurisdictions that don't have to be necessarily solved at the federal level, but federal leadership will certainly help move the ball forward much more considerably. And I think back to the climate science point of it, is that there needs to be a sense of urgency. And it won't be solved with taking a single lens to the problem. And in particular, come back to thinking of Millennium Development Goals, international landscape, when one thinks of, for example, what's happening in the alternative energy space in China, India, Korea, Japan, Brazil, European Union, et cetera. There are a plethora of different approaches toward this problem, all with a different balance, shall I say, of policy, some of which include global climate and approaching climate change, but others which are very centric on dealing with local environmental issues, creating a local manufacturing base, creating intellectual leadership, and dealing with local health issues as well, and other environmental pieces like water, et cetera.
Okay, so what I heard a number of different times was the word local. Local, local, local. So let me posit for you a statement and invite you to either climb on board and support it or take a different perspective. The United States of America will never join a global climate treaty that mandates 20, 30, 40, or an 80% reduction, nor should it. The US Congress will be challenged, if ever, to adopt a national program. The change that we're talking about will come about from the states, from the localities, the businesses that see it in their interest to reduce carbon emissions for reasons other than the need to prevent glaciers from melting and endangering species in the Arctic. They'll do it because it's in their own economic well-being to do so. That the sooner we get to the point where this solution is from the local perspective, from the states, from the businesses, the sooner we realize that the next COP should be held over net meeting or GoToMeeting, that we're better off looking for solutions in the state capitals, the sooner we're going to get to a solution that has teeth that will make a difference. Does this make sense, Carl?
Yeah, let me say a couple things. One, I want to distinguish between coal and oil. I think for coal, most of the solutions lie at the state and local level for the reasons you described. It is the nature of the way we manage our transportation system that I think the solutions largely will need to be federal, but I agree with you, they will not be implemented to save the climate. They will be implemented to deal with trade deficits, national security, public health, and economic issues. I also halfway agree with your statement about what Congress will and won't ratify and do. I don't believe we will decarbonize our economy by adopting a treaty or a law which requires us to do so. But once we are relatively far down the pathway to decarbonizing our economy, I believe we will then see national and global action to finish the job, because if 2/3 of the states are moving, they will be worried about what they've done being undone by uncooperative neighbors. So once you get 2/3 of the world, of the states behaving in a certain way, you can mandate that the other third catch up. But you can't mandate that 2/3 exercise leadership through a national program.
Okay.
I think I have a complementary comment on that one, which is it's not an either or, it's an and question. There are multiple jurisdictions that one has to think about. And I think it is that it's a combination of policies across jurisdictions, across technology landscapes, across different policy goals that are going to all play into creating the solution. So I don't see it as a competition per se, but really as a cooperative engagement across those jurisdictions.
Well, it was because of what you have said that I proposed this alliance of what's already in the kitchen, as you characterized it, although promoted by the president, as you said, also through the bully pulpit. That is 2/3, or very close. I think it's 64%. And you're right, if those 36 states made such an alliance, or whatever you would like to call it, then in order to get away from the problem of leakage, they would certainly encourage the remaining states to join, and I would think that the remaining states, vice versa, looking at 2/3 doing this, would feel that if they don't get on board, that they're going to be left behind. So I think if the president's listening, after the election, I think if he convened a White House meeting on this, some progress, even in the likelihood that the House of Representatives changes from Democrat-controlled to Republican, I think that can be, you can go around that this way.
Okay, then I'll lay another positive on the table, that the solution will not have the word climate in it. This will be about energy, jobs, global security. It'll be about education, entrepreneurship. That anybody who launches the next bill with the word climate as in the title hasn't been participating in the last couple of years.
Well, the three regions, not one of the three regions in its name has the word climate. Not one of them, right?
Are there any ideas for the...
I have many points. What I did with culture, nobody was sort of listening to culture. Culture is soft. It's soft because you sort of don't feel it in front of your face, or they don't really understand. So what we did, we built an internet site, and now we're going around different countries, and we have this site in many countries, and now we're translating it. And I did a lot of media interviews about 6 years ago to bring awareness that there was money to be made in culture, tourism, or culture, whatever. And the more we spoke about it, the more we opened more gates. And there's more interest than ever in fairs and many other things now. And it's a huge market. Now, that's one way of finding a solution. Of course, Washington is a big solution. But building from bottom up is crucial. Because your top is never going to be the same. Who's in Washington changes all the time. But the people in the street don't. So you need to build something that's bottom up. So maybe there's ways that we can help you to do that. But I'm very concerned about Mr. Schlesinger, Michael. You said that students came to your class, and with all the knowledge that you have, and they're actually they're not forced to go to your class, right? They have to sign up, correct?
It's not compulsory.
Okay, so
For me it is, but
no,
that's why
I
I'm
just
here.
don't understand how they would not understand how important it is. If they've already signed up, is there a wall? What is going on? How can there be a wall if someone signs up and they're interested, and you've done all the work that you've done in your career, you're well known in your field, and they don't get it? There's something I'm not getting here.
Haven't you ever met someone like that?
Well,
I mean, that's where the statement, my mind's made up, don't confuse me with the facts. So if I show them, in fact, I published a paper 10 years ago called something about the causes of the warming in the 19th and 20th centuries, in which we updated my postdoc who's teaching my class has done this work, so we're going to publish this and update again, which shows even more strongly that it's due to human beings. So I present this, in fact, he's presenting this right now to my class, and those who come in with blinders say, no, it's natural variability. It's not us. And when I show them the results that it's not natural variability, they disbelieve it.
That's pretty worrisome. That's very worrisome because they signed up for your class to hear and listen and to be open to a subject. That's even more worrisome. Anyway, so
Yeah.
I just wanted to bring that up. I think that what you need is marketing. By just listening to all of you, you need marketing.
You mean I'm not convincing, is what you're saying?
No. I'm sure that you just know all the facts. You have. What I would probably do in terms of marketing is, of course, go through the internet, because I don't know any better in reaching out to so many people. That's the way, but it's showing the disaster on a visual basis. All the disaster scenarios from all the different point of views would be very important, and for you to all gather together and basically engage in showing the world what the world looks like in 3 years, 10 years, 15, and 40 years from now, and really put some images to what you're saying.
Well, I've been doing exactly that for almost 40 years now.
Okay,
I mean,
so maybe
some
we
people,
can
this
help
is
market
like
it.
religion.
Right.
It is like it's stronger
Yeah.
than a philosophy.
Yeah, it's tough.
And there's no way, as I jokingly said, that if I tell the Pope that there's no God, he's not going to be convinced. I don't care about your marketing.
Well, there's a few issues that I don't know much about anything, but I started looking at the CO2 emission from China versus India and versus the United States a few days ago, and the United States is way up there. One of the questions I have for all of you is when India and China is going to be in full-fledged and developing in terms of economies. They're not doing very badly right now as we speak, probably better than here. What kind of threat do we have when all those countries are functioning like America is today?
It's scary, isn't it? Because
I mean, when I
a
started
Chinese,
I never realized.
it's scary. In China, they aspire to be American, to consume like an American, to have what we have. But their emissions are a fraction, 10%, 20% at best. Most of it's
person.
far less than
Per person, but as a country now,
per person. So it's scary to think that when they achieve what they want, when they grab it, And who are we to deny them the ability to grow? The Chinese are responsible for about 17% of the greenhouse gas that have been put in the atmosphere so far.
In America?
I don't know the answer. But
Well, for the gas that's already there, we are it.
We are
basically.
it.
We are
We're
it,
number
yes.
one.
Over the
Now,
last,
can you tell me something else? When I look at the media and they're always criticizing environment and pollution in Beijing, why aren't they looking at themselves first?
let me just tell you one thing.
Well, what's wrong?
When I was born, there were 2.5 billion people. And in my lifetime, I'm 67, the world's population has almost tripled. I tell this to my students, who are 18, 19, 20. And by the middle of the century, there'll be maybe 9 billion people, 7 billion of whom will be living in poverty. I think that's our main problem. But we're stuck. We've painted ourselves into a population corner, I'm afraid. So you're right. I mean, they want to be Americans in terms of per capita energy use. In India and China, each person uses on average 1/6 as much energy as we, and their population is 7 times bigger than ours. And so you do the math. If they come up to our per capita consumption, and since we contribute 1/4 now of the CO2 gas to the atmosphere, they have the potential, those two countries alone, to emit 10 times more than the entire world does now.
and that should keep you up at night, but also reflecting on what Carl said and Doug had said, in the challenge, we also have the opportunity, because as Carl held up his phone, the technology, nothing about that technology was there 10 years ago. The renewable sources that are available to the Chinese, should the incentives be lined up, are available like they weren't available to us.
So maybe what we could do to help you to be tangible is if you were willing to find the information for us, images and whatever is required to do a proper site, then we can get corporations, maybe you can make a list, you probably know them off by heart, all the corporations that really care about the matter, where they can use it as a marketing tool if they want to show good, and then we can maybe help you. But we really need your expertise in terms of the visual, the mathematics, the proof. I know that Tom has been working at MIT quite a lot on proving the scenarios, but it won't hit really the individual that is in Texas unless we show them models, photographs, what is going to be the impact in his garden, because people are selfish. And that's what we're living, and that's the kind of atmosphere that we're living in. That's why we have the financial crisis. So unless we have real visual impact that to convince people and to go and do campaigns. I mean, it's the only way that we're going to get out there, but with the internet as well.
I would advise you don't use mathematics. I try to do this with my students who are not scientists or engineers or mathematicians, and despite the entrance requirements to get into the University of Illinois, you show them an equation. In fact, I had a federal judge who was at a debate I was in with a climate skeptic, and he told me afterwards, as soon as you put up one equation, it was the energy balance for the whole Earth in space, he said he tuned out. This is a federal judge. So don't use math.
Tom.
So I was going to combine some optimism and some pessimism. Optimism in response to or kind of following on the comments you two were making about what happens when all the millions of people in India and China live at the same standard of living that we do as they aspire to. I'm actually very optimistic that we can solve that problem technologically. That is, I believe, as you were saying, there are renewable energy, there's kind of energy conservation. I think to some degree, our sense of what it means to have a high standard of living will change. That we'll spend more of our per capita income on things like iPods and less on things like Toyotas. More information-intensive consumption that isn't very polluting, may well come to be seen as more important. In fact, I think today, I think I've heard somewhere that a lot of 20-somethings would far sooner give up their car than their high-speed internet connection. So that may be a harbinger of what a very affluent but not very emission-intensive economy will look like. I'm very optimistic that it's possible to solve a lot of these problems with technology. The thing I'm more questioning, and maybe even a little pessimistic, actually I am pessimistic in the short term, is about the political things that we've been talking about. I think there are a lot of people who are going to be very hard to change their minds. You know, I'm often reminded in discussions like these about the old cliche that citizens in a democracy get the government they deserve. So I'm afraid we don't yet deserve a very enlightened climate policy. And it may take a while before we do. The question is whether we can deserve it soon enough.
The politicians are a challenge, but let's also bring it back to communication and think about the story of Kitty Genovese, who was the victim of a horrible crime, which was watched by dozens of people. And each person who saw the other person, who saw the crime being committed, decided not to do anything. So when we're in the commons, as Garrett Hardin says, and it seems okay to us to watch the commons be decimated, which brings us back to Louise's, I think, suggestion that there is money to be made in solving this problem. There's money to be made in making it enlightened self-interest to solve this problem. To do it not because it's the right thing to do, because you have faith, but because you'll be better off. So from my perspective, our challenge, our objective ought to be to make it very clear in a personal way to you, to your kids, to your next generation, that they're going to be better off if we solve this thing in the right way. Any other questions? Okay, we're done. Thank you very much for participating, our panelists. Appreciate it.